Tickets, everyone? Tickets. Yes, thank you. I am your gracious host, the Creeper. Welcome to Carnival X. Tonight's show is a collection of 4 tales that include stories of a skeletal bride, some ghastly trick-or-treaters, a friendship request from a strange child, and more. Please step right this way into tent number 1. In here, we will experience the story of a bride who waits for her groom to find her in a very peculiar place. Please enjoy our first tale, titled, "There is Talk of a Bridal Skeleton Haunting My Village. She Wanted Me to Be Her Groom." There is an old Welsh myth about a doomed couple. In an old village not too far away from my hometown, every time someone got married, the bride hid, and the groom had to find her before the marriage could commence. But once, at the marriage of a local rich man's son and a baker's daughter, the groom could not find the bride. For 5 years he searched, and eventually it broke him. He committed suicide. That very same night, a lightning strike hit the biggest tree in the village. Inside was the skeleton of his bride. Growing up, I'd always thought the story of the hidden bride was a myth. But my uncle never agreed. He insisted that her skeletal form still flows through the air after dark, chasing him. Since he was the only person ever to claim this, and he had more alcohol in his blood than sense, he was seen as a madman. Then he disappeared. They never found his body, but they found his blood. I found his blood. I had been trick-or-treating with my friends on Halloween night. My uncle had disappeared only days before, and I was doing it to make my mind of it all. We had made the usual rounds past the post office, up through the richer district, and we were taking a shortcut past the village cops to the church, the only well-reputed source of full-size Snickers. But something caught my eye, and with every bone in my body, I wish it hadn't. There was a trail in the grass. It looked as if a disemboweled snake had dragged itself into the cops, but this blood smelled strong of Lancaster beer, Uncle's favorite. My friends decided to run to the church and get help, but I chose to follow the trail. It took me into the cops, and that's where it started. The laughing. It was a joyful laughter, like one that might come from a couple playing on their wedding day. But only one voice laughed, and its laugh was distorted. Scratchy like Granddad's old record player, and faster than is natural. Moving, always moving. I would run to where I heard it, and all of a sudden it was over the road, or under the bridge I just ran over, or, in this case, from just behind the tree my uncle's blood ran out at. In that moment, I ran to the church. I regret it, for I feel that night in the cops was my only chance to stop what was now in motion. Every time I was out after dark, the laughing haunted me. I started seeing things too, things I didn't want to be real. A floating silhouette, clad in dress and veil. Soon, it was more than a silhouette. A gray face made of rotted bones staring me down. Her cheekbones were high, and what remained of her other features gaunt. I saw her form clinging to my window every night, bashing it, but her broken fingers could not break through. The doctors blamed it on the death of my uncle. They said that I was hallucinating the same as him, because that's what I thought killed him. And my parents believed them. I believed them until the bride finally got me. I was walking in the copse, heading to the spot my uncle's blood ran out, where I had placed a makeshift memorial for him. The skeletal bride descended upon me. She flew down from the highest tree, scaring the birds as she went. Her cold hands clasped around me, digging into my skull. I felt them wriggling in my skull like maggots. Suddenly, I had no more force to fight back. I fell unconscious, and my last sight was the ground hurtling toward me at an alarming rate. When I came back to my senses, the first thing I felt were the tight walls that confined me. I was stuck in a circular cell, cold wood surrounding me. Then the hands. They grew from the wood and wrapped around me. Freezing, skeletal fingers clasped my arms and legs. A hand grasped my jaw, pulling it open. I saw a human spine sliver up from the base of the tree. It curled backward like a snake about to bite, then jabbed itself into my mouth. I bit down hard. The hands clasped tighter, then retreated back into the woodwork. The spine fell backwards, defeated. I threw my body at the wood walls of my container, breaking them faster than I expected. I fell forward out onto the ground and looked back where I came to see a gaping hole in a massive oak. If that wasn't frightening enough to scare you away from marriage for good, nothing is. Please step this way to the second tent. In this tent, we have a fun-sized tale of a grandmother who doesn't want to leave her husband alone. I hope you enjoy our second tale of the evening, called Grandma's Ghost. In 2005, when I was 10 years old, my parents, my big brother, and I all moved into our grandparents' house after my grandma died of cancer, so we could take care of Grandpa. They had a house with 2 floors. My grandpa's room was downstairs, and we lived upstairs. There were a few weird things going on in this house that my whole family witnessed. But I want to start with this one. It was nighttime, and my mom was sleeping in bed with me when she suddenly heard a noise. At first, she thought it came from outside, so she opened the window to listen. But after a second, she realized it came from downstairs. I remember her telling me to stay upstairs, but I went downstairs after her. The noise came from my grandpa's bedroom as he was shouting for help. But when my mom wanted to open his door, it was locked. We still don't know why it was locked, since he usually didn't do this. My mom asked what was wrong. He said he fell over and couldn't get up by himself and couldn't move. So I went upstairs to wake my brother. We tried to somehow unlock that door with no success. My mom called an ambulance and the police to open the door. While we were waiting, we tried to open it again and again, but gave up at some point and just waited in front of his door, talking to him. A few minutes before the ambulance and police arrived, we heard the key turn around in his bedroom's door. None of us were touching it. And we immediately went in to look after my grandpa, who was sitting in the middle of his room, like 2 to 3 meters away from the door. Luckily, he was fine, but the ambulance still took him to the hospital just to check and make sure. When my mom and my brother visited him in the hospital the next day to pick him up, my brother asked him how he managed to unlock the door, since he said he couldn't move and was sitting quite far away from the door. My grandpa just laughed and said, "I didn't." What do you think, friends? Was it Grandma who locked Grandpa's door and terrorized him? Or was it some other thing? Well, it's time to move on to our third tale of the evening. Right this way. In this tent, we meet a mysterious child who really wants to be friends with our protagonists. For our third tale of the evening, please enjoy My Best Friend Disappeared a Week Before Halloween. We all have rituals, things we do to keep a sense of normalcy, to keep our feet on the ground. When I was a kid, my ritual was riding my bike down Coulter Street with my best friend Jonas. Every Saturday, we'd go to the top of the hill and ride down like the devil himself was after us. Coulter Street was steep and dangerous, but damn if it didn't feel good to ride down. We used to race each other at first, but eventually, we just rode for the sake of riding. My life was kind of chaotic back then. My parents weren't always on great terms with each other, so riding down that hill was always an escape for me. Then one summer, when I turned 11 years old, everything changed. Jonas and I had made it to the top of Coulter Street like we always did. I'll never forget how hot it was that day. The humidity made it worse. Every step felt like you were walking through a sauna. We were getting ready to ride down when he showed up. There were two things that preceded his arrival. The sound of Mr. Abernathy's old dog barking wildly from somewhere in the distance, and the sound of wings flapping as a murder of crows made their ascent to the sky. "Can I bike with you guys?" he asked. Jonas and I turned in surprise at the sound of the voice. The kid standing before us looked about our age. His hair was brown and longish. His skin was pale, and he had bags under his eyes. His clothes were tattered and looked like hand-me-downs. His bicycle looked ancient compared to the sleeker models Jonas and I had. He looked poor, but there was something else too. When I think back on it, he looked mythic in some ways, like he had leapt from the pages of some lost great American novel. He looked completely out of place. "Sure," I said. "We're just gonna ride down the hill." You might be thinking how strange it is that I didn't ask the boy his name, but when you're 11 years old, those kind of things don't always jump to mind right away. Sometimes you meet a strange boy, and you don't ask him his name. And he was a strange boy. Not just how unkempt looking he was, but the town of Raleigh wasn't very big, and I was familiar with just about every boy my age. Didn't know them all by name, but I knew of them at least. We all went to the same school after all. In small towns like Raleigh, everybody seems to know everybody. But I had never seen this kid before in my life. In any case, we rode down the hill. Me, Jonas, and the strange new boy. And when we reached the bottom, the boy just nodded and then rode away. "Maybe he's from Jefferson," Jonas said when the boy was gone. Jefferson was another town that was far away. It seemed unlikely that he rode all the way from Jefferson on his own, so Jonas and I came to the conclusion that he must have moved from Jefferson to Raleigh this summer with his folks. That's how we got to calling him the Jefferson Kid. Throughout the following week, Jonas and I wondered if the Jefferson Kid would show up again on Saturday to ride down with us. We joked about his sudden appearance the other day. But deep down, there was something being unspoken between us. The truth of it was, the Jefferson Kid had unsettled us, not only intruding on our Saturday ritual, but there was something off about him. His old and tattered clothes, pale white skin, and those sunken, tired-looking eyes. Sure enough, the very next Saturday, he appeared again. This time, he didn't even ask our permission to bike with us. He simply rode up on that old-looking bike of his and nodded. Now, you might be thinking that this is when I finally asked him his name. But you'd be wrong. Instead, I turned to Jonas, who shrugged. And the shrug said everything to me. We wouldn't question the Jefferson Kid. We'd simply allow him to be here with us. And so, the three of us rode down the hill. And when we reached the bottom, the Jefferson Kid merely nodded again and rode off. And that's how our Saturdays went that summer. We'd reach the top of the hill, and without fail, the Jefferson Kid would appear and we'd ride down with him. He never asked us our names, and we never asked his. During the week, Jonas and I never discussed how the Jefferson Kid knew when to appear on Saturday, especially when we didn't always go at the same time. We didn't discuss his tattered clothes or sunken eyes. We accepted his company, while also completely ignoring him. Because there was something in the back of our heads that was screaming that something was completely wrong about the boy. And neither Jonas nor I wanted to acknowledge it. And we never ever spoke to the Jefferson Kid as we reached the bottom of the hill. He would simply nod and ride away. That was until one Saturday late in August. We reached the bottom of the hill, but instead of nodding and riding away, the Jefferson Kid turned to Jonas and me and spoke. "You guys want to see my house?" It was surreal hearing him talk. He had only ever said one thing to us before when he asked if he could bike with us. We had accepted him as a part of our ritual, and throughout the weeks he eventually blended in. Him speaking cut through all of that and reminded Jonas and me of his strange intrusion into our lives. Your house?" was all I could say. "Yeah," the Jefferson Kid said. "You want to come see it? Since we're friends and all." All this time, I had never considered the Jefferson Kid my friend. Yet, hearing him call me that made me feel ashamed of myself, of how coldly I had treated him during our bike rides. I turned to Jonas, and I could tell he was having the same reaction. When Jonas caught my eyes, he simply shrugged, though it was a meek and unsure shrug. "Okay," I said. "Let's go to your house. I have to eat supper soon, but I can come by for a little." "Okay," the Jefferson Kid said, smiling. "Follow me." As we followed the Jefferson Kid on our bikes, I was hoping he would lead us toward one of the familiar cul-de-sacs or neighborhoods around Raleigh. But as we rode, I started to see that that wouldn't be the case, because we were heading toward the edge of Raleigh, toward the woods that surrounded the town. We turned onto one of the beat-up dirt roads that went through the woods. Eventually, we turned onto an even more beat-up path that took us deeper in. The trees seemed to leer down at us. It was getting dark, and I was starting to feel uneasy. The path was getting more overgrown the further we went, and less welcoming for riding. I had never gone this far into the woods before. Eventually, and surprisingly, we came upon a 2-story house. It was the worst-looking home I had ever seen. If you looked up the word dilapidated in the dictionary, there would surely be a picture of this house. The roof seemed to be sinking in on itself. Many of the windows were boarded up or shattered. The wood was dark and mossy, and the angles of the house were just wrong. I wouldn't have been able to describe it this way at the time, but now as an adult, I can tell you the house looked like something out of a 1920s German expressionist film. And there were no lights on. Yet, the Jefferson Kid rode up to the house as casual as can be. Jonas and I merely stared at the house in shock. "You live here?" Jonas said. "Sure do," the Jefferson Kid said. He kicked out his bike stand and walked up the porch. The wood creaked horribly beneath his feet, and when he opened the door, I thought for sure it would come off its hinges. Through the doorway, I could see nothing but darkness. "Are your parents home?" I asked. The Jefferson Kid didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the dark entryway. The shadows of the house enveloped him in an instant. "Are you guys coming?" The Jefferson Kid's voice came from somewhere in the house, but he was not visible at all. Staring into the darkness of the doorway was almost hypnotizing. I could feel something pulling at me, inviting me into the house. I quickly turned away and blinked my eyes. Sorry, but I have to go now. Jonas does too," I said. And when I looked at Jonas, I could see he felt the same thing I had just felt. The pull. "Already?" the Jefferson Kid said from inside that hellish home. "Are you sure you don't want to come inside?" This time I didn't answer. I turned my bike around and hit Jonas on the arm, and in seconds we were riding away. I didn't even know the way back. I simply rode, and this time I really did feel as if the devil was behind me. We rode for what felt like an eternity, but eventually Jonas and I made it back onto the dirt road and eventually back into town, somehow. Jonas and I agreed on several things that night: that we would never go back to that house, and that we would never ride down Coulter Street again, for fear of running into the Jefferson Kid. And if we ever did see the Jefferson Kid again, we would not speak to him, and we would tell each other. A couple of weeks had passed and the new school year was about to begin. The leaves had begun to turn from bright greens to shades of brown, yellow, and red. I loved fall. It was the perfect time of the year. Saying goodbye to those gross, humid days and hello to crisp, clear autumn weather. Those Saturdays spent with Jonas and the Jefferson Kid started to feel like a surreal dream, even though not much time had actually passed. Jonas and I had not spoken about the house in the woods since that night. My mom dropped me off on the first day of school. She had another terrible argument with Dad that morning. I was beginning to miss those bike rides down Coulter Street. They were so good at clearing my head and making me forget my worries. But I couldn't risk going back there and running into him. Seeing the school building would normally be demoralizing, as I hated the end of summer. But on this day, it felt good. Wholesome even. And it was my first day of middle school. A whole new adventure awaited me. I was ready to put the events of the summer behind me. As I walked toward the building, I saw Jonas's familiar face. We slapped hands and made our way inside. Jonas seemed to be in good spirits. He made several jokes about the start of the year and which one of us would get a girlfriend first. Still, there was an unspoken question hanging between us. Would the Jefferson Kid show up to school? We had both theorized that the Jefferson Kid had moved from Jefferson to Raleigh with his parents during the summer, although he never gave us his age. If I had to guess, I would have said he was 11, like Jonas and me. Which means, if he was going to school, he should have been there that day. As Jonas and I walked into our first class, I was almost terrified that we'd see the Jefferson Kid sitting in the back of the room, wearing those old, tattered clothes, staring at us with those tired, sunken eyes. "Want to come over to my house again?" I shuddered at the thought, but as I walked in, he was nowhere to be seen. And he didn't show up at all throughout the rest of the day. And at the end of the day, I had almost completely forgotten about him. Almost. Because while there was a part of me that was terrified of running into him, there was another part of me that wanted him to show up. Because if he did show up to school, it would mean that maybe he was just a normal kid after all. Dirt poor and living in a dilapidated home in the woods, but normal all the same. After all, monsters don't go to school and get homework, right? I felt an alarming sense of dread as the last bell of the school day rang. The Jefferson Kid didn't show up, which means the Jefferson Kid might not have been a normal kid after all. He might not have been a kid in the first place. I kept thinking of that pulling sensation coming from the house, like something was beckoning me to walk into the house. The following weeks went fairly normally. I woke up, ate breakfast. Mom and Dad fought. Mom dropped me off at school. I came home, did homework, woke up, rinse and repeat. I still hung out with Jonas on the weekends, though we didn't go biking as much. Part of it was that the weather was getting colder, but also, our bikes were a reminder of our time with the Jefferson Kid. It wasn't until just a week before Halloween that things took a turn for the worse. I'll never forget that night. It was 9 p.m., and I was sitting in the living room watching TV with my dad, who was nursing his fourth beer of the night. Phone rang and my mom answered. After what sounded like a worried conversation, my mom stepped in the living room, holding the phone to her shoulder. "Sweetie," my mom said to me, "have you seen Jonas today?" I saw him at school," I said. "Did he say he was going anywhere today? After school?" my mom asked. "No, why?" My mom didn't answer. She got back on the phone, and then a couple minutes later hung up and came back into the living room. That was Jonas's mom, my mother said. She said Jonas never came home today. They're going to be calling the police soon. Waste of resources, my father said. These kids always go running off. They'll show up again. Trust me. This resulted in another argument between my parents. I didn't even hear them. I had gotten good at zoning them out. I sat there and stared blankly at the television. Jonas never came home? What could have happened to him? But deep in the back of my head, I already knew the answer. I walked up to my bedroom and looked out the window. Our house was on a hill, not unlike Coulter Street. In the distance, if you looked hard enough, you could see just the beginnings of the woods that surrounded Raleigh. And somewhere deep in those woods was a 2-story house that was home to a boy that my friend Jonas and I called the Jefferson Kid. I didn't want to believe Jonas was there, but deep in the back of my head, there was a part of me that knew he was. And that part of me was screaming. Terrifying. Did the Jefferson Kid finally lure Jonas into his house? If so, what happened to him? Many things to ponder, my friends. If you'll kindly follow me over to the 4th tent, we will get to our next story. Our final tale this evening features a Halloween humbug who is forced to grow up rather quickly. For your pleasure, we present Don't Ignore the Trick-or-Treaters When They Come Knocking. Respect tradition. Halloween. How I loathe that holiday. Dark, gloomy nights, freezing winds, and all the trees are practically dead. But the one thing I hated the most about that holiday was all the damn trick-or-treating. I mean, come on. Who decided that once a year, everyone in the whole damn town had to buy a boatload of candy and feed other people's kids? I mean, the diabetes crisis aside, it just seems plain wrong that I'd be expected to assist in giving little Jennifer from down the road cavities. Anyway, that's what I used to think. That is how I used to act around this time of year. Until last year, that is. I remember it well. It was a blustery cold night, wind was howling, and I was just about to snuggle down with my dog and watch A Nightmare on Elm Street. Then I heard it, the all too familiar giggling of excited children as their little feet tapped their way up toward my door. Oh no you don't, I thought to myself. Switching out the lights, I bathed the room in darkness and closed the curtains for good measure. However, this appeared to do little to prevent the trick-or-treaters, for within moments of turning off the lights, it came. That high-pitched tone from the doorbell. I ignored it, defiantly. I refused to take part in a holiday created for the sole purpose of making confectionery companies profit. that infernal buzzer chimed, yet I refused to be moved. Time and again they came, new groups of kids from all over town. They'd ring my doorbell as though it was some kind of whistle, commanding me to grant them the candy that they believed they were entitled to. However, each and every time they came, I just turned the volume higher on the TV, until Heather Langenkamp's screams and Robert Englund's nightmarish voice drowned out the doorbell. Eventually, the trick-or-treaters stopped coming. I know what you're thinking. God, what a scrounge. I was, but I don't deny it. My mother would always warn me not to be, to respect the holidays, especially Halloween. Bad things happen to those who ignore tradition, my mother would often warn. I wish her words had been in my mind that night. Perhaps it could have prevented all that was to come. Alas, I was not thinking of my mother's words that night. No. Instead, I was greedily shoveling popcorn and chocolate into my mouth, as me and Rex, my dog, watched Friday the 13th. Then I heard it, that blasted doorbell, ringing out, its buzzing sound spearing through the opening scene of the film. So up I turned the volume. They'd give up eventually, I thought. Went the doorbell, and before the chime could finish sounding out, it rang again and again, each time quicker than the last. "Fine," I yelled. Clambering up from my seat, I went to the door, swinging it open. Before me, a child wrapped in toilet roll bandages, and another dressed up in a cheap-looking Dracula getup, complete with a retro Dracula mask and slicked back hair. "Trick or treat," the two boys called out. "I'm sorry, I don't do Halloween," I said, but as I was about to close the door, the pair of them held up their burlap sack-like bags. "Trick or treat," they simultaneously repeated, gesturing their bags up to me. "Sorry, boys, I don't have any candy. Now please, you should go home. It's way too late to be trick-or-treating," I said, tapping my watch, which indicated the time was 11:30. "Trick or treat," the pair spoke once more. This time, their voices twitching with a sense of urgency. "No, I told you I don't do Halloween. Now go away," I shouted, before slamming shut the door and charging back toward the living room. The doorbell chimed. "That is it. I swear I'm going to lose it," I ranted to myself. However, as I opened the door, a gust of wind blew in, and through the voices of children giggling and laughing echoed out, I found my doorstep and the street empty. Feeling a little spooked, I shut the door and went back to the living room. Yet no sooner had I sat down, I heard them again. Giggling and laughing, childish sounds running around outside of my living room window. Then came a great thwack. A noise so loud it made both me and Rex jump up with fright. They're egging my house, I thought. So, like the self-assured idiot that I was, I pulled open the curtains, but it wasn't egg on my window. No, disturbingly, it was a small, muddy handprint, just slap bang in the middle of the glass pane. I looked out into the dark and saw them, the pair of them standing beneath the flickering glow of the lamppost outside. Then, suddenly, they were gone. No joke, seriously, 1 minute they were there, I blinked, and then they were gone. Without warning, the television switched over, with the booming voice of the news anchor nearly causing me to leap from my skin. Looking at the television, I saw the dated and colorful newsroom and the vibrantly clothed female anchor. Her large hairsprayed bouffant and pink blazer screamed 80s, but in contrast to her bright colors, the story she reported was anything but bright. The search for the 2 trick-or-treaters continues tonight as concerns grow for the boys' safety. Police are urging anyone with any information to come forward, and have stated that while it's too soon to say anything, they are not ruling out the possibility of foul play, the presenter recited. I flicked the channel back over to what I was watching, but the minute I did, there was another loud thwack. Turning toward the window, I saw another handprint had smeared itself onto the glass. Tonight, the hunt for the missing twin brothers comes to a grisly and terrible end. Police have confirmed that the bodies found in the creek belong to the 2 boys who went missing only a week ago on Halloween night, the news presenter's voice declared. Her words came so abruptly that I was once again startled by them. Odd. Perhaps Rex sat on the remote when I wasn't looking. Yeah, that's rational. That's what I thought. However, my rationality began to slink away when I suddenly realized I had seen this televised news report before, a long time ago. It was almost a fleeting moment of remembrance, like the kind you get when reminiscing about a distant dream. Yet, I was certain. I had seen this woman, this report in fact, before. 1983, the Halloween when those kids went missing. That's where I had seen it. I remember being sat on the couch watching the news with my parents at either side of me, talking about how terrible it was that this had happened in our town. I was around the same age as the boys at the time of the disappearance. So, if this was that very same report, then why was it playing now on my television? I went to turn the channel over, but as I did, it instantly snapped back to that same 1980s news anchor with her bright pink blazer and large bouffant hair. Pressing the off button, the television screen went black. For a minute. Then, suddenly she was back on the screen, reporting the outdated news in her bright pink blazer. Police are urging anyone who saw the boys the night they disappeared to come forward. Tim and James Coltweather were last seen heading down toward Emerson Road on the 31st of October. The boys were dressed as Dracula and the Mummy. They're both 11 years old and quite small for their age, the newswoman recited, her voice electric and almost robotic. A cold feeling dawned on me. Emerson Road. That was my street. An even more dreaded realization sank in. Dracula and the Mummy. That's what they were dressed up as. Those kids who knocked at my door earlier. A cacophony of banging struck the windows of my house, shaking the structure of the room. It was like fireworks or cherry crackers were ricocheting around my 2-floored home, battering every surface with violent strikes. "Stop it," I yelled. And instantly, it did just that. Everything fell silent, and Rex, my brave Whippet X, recoiled and shrunk, shrinking himself into the corner of the room as though he had seen a ghost. I approached the window to see the damage and found the window covered in filthy handprints. There had to be hundreds of them, all clustering together, caked in mud and other foul things. "What the?" I went to speak aloud, but my words stopped short. I noticed something. Something that thundered terror into my heart. Running my fingers across the pane, I felt the stinking rotten earth as its wet, dripping sludge smeared onto me. The handprints were on the inside. Backing away, I looked to Rex, but he scrambled from the corner of the room and raced upstairs. Urgently, I went to follow, only for the lights to flash on without warning, flickering above me and revealing festering fingerprints and dirty hands all over the room and all throughout the house. The bulb above me exploded, showering me in glass and sparks as I fell back. Everything went dark. The television, the lights, everything. All around me was a thick black veil, and as I struggled to find my way toward the living room door, I felt it. A gust of wind raced past me, carrying with it the ghostly giggles of children. "Trick," a coarse voice croaked from behind me. I reached for the door, but it slammed shut, locking me in the room with the invasive presence. "Or tree," another voice wheezed. Chill crucified my feet to the spot and froze my body where it stood. Then came the smell, a wretched perfume that rolled in like a noxious fog. It filled the room and smothered the clean air, drowning my senses in a diseased miasma. I knew what the deathly stench was, and I knew what awaited my eyes if I turned to look upon my tormentors. "Trick or treat," the two groaned, their watery voices dripping the words into my ears and causing all the hair on the back of my neck to stand up. I'm sorry, I didn't know," I whimpered. Turning around slowly, I saw them standing before me, their burlap sack bags held up toward me. Grotesquely, they no longer appeared as they had before. No. Their childlike visage of youthful boys, clothed in cheap costumes, was now butchered and mutilated beyond recognition. One of the boys was a rotten maggot pile of green, brown, and black sludge stuffed inside soaking wet toilet roll bandages. The other had a deep red line cut into the skin on his throat, and his empty eye sockets stared out from behind his damaged retro vampire mask. Worse still was his skin, which was a dreadful white and lumpy like porridge oats, and black necrotic tears cracked his porcelain lips. "Please, I didn't know, I stammered, my lips quivering with each and every syllable. Anxiously, I bowed my head and lowered my eyes, too afraid to look at their ghastly sight. "Trick or treat," urged the mummy-dressed boy, the words almost causing his decayed jaw to snap off. "Right, okay," I said. Nervously, I grabbed my popcorn bowl and the chocolate bars that I had out for my horror movie marathon and began to distribute the treats between them. With shaking hands, I tipped the popcorn into the dirty burlap sacks, which they held out to me, and placed a chocolate bar in each. "Happy Halloween," the drowned Dracula wheezed, his words gurgling. "Yeah, Happy Halloween," I repeated, whilst internally praying that this would sate their restless souls. Then, just like that, they were gone. And so were all the handprints and any other sign of their presence. Even the lights which had shattered above my head were seemingly restored as they flashed back on. Yet, despite light returning and the two specters having departed, me and my fearful companion Rex lay awake for the rest of the night. In fact, we didn't do much sleeping in the nights that followed. The ghostly visitation had left me frightened to my core, so much so that it made me go back and look up their case. It was awful. 2 10-year-old twin boys, taken before their time. They never found the sicko who killed the kids, but the police suspected that it had to be someone on Emerson Road. Worse still, they think that he must have snatched them when they came to his door and held them captive for days. The poor things were strangled and dumped in the river after a week or two. I've since moved away from Emerson Road, but even though I'm far from that place, the fear I felt that night has made sure of one thing. This Halloween, I will be answering the doors to trick-or-treaters and respecting the traditions of the holiday. Let that be a lesson to you, Halloween haters. If you don't respect the tradition will not respect you. Well, ladies and ghouls, that wraps up our presentation for the evening. I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Very soon. Remember to monster mash that subscribe button and click the little Franken chime next to it. That'll ensure that you'll be alerted by the elder YouTube gods when we present our next set of lovely tales to trick or treat by. Until next time, respect the tradition. Good evening, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. Tonight we begin a tale of a mysterious newspaper. Nobody knows where it comes from, or who it comes from. We now present There's a Strange Newspaper That's Only Delivered at Midnight, Part 1. My dad called it the Midnight Paper. It was exactly what it sounded like. A strange kind of newspaper that would show up at some homes at midnight, on the dot. every Wednesday and Friday for us, but on other nights for other houses. I loved hearing about it. We'd sit at his office, late at night, late for me at that age, but that's all I did, hear about it. I never saw one, even though my dad said he had many copies. He never told me any of the stories that were supposedly printed on it. So after a while, I lost interest, grew out of it, until now. After the funeral, I decided to stay at my parents' for a while. See to their bills, think about what to do with the mountain of personal belongings that absolutely nobody would want. It was a Friday. Before I knew it, it was midnight. I'd stayed up in the office, poring over a pile of unpaid hospital bills when I heard it. 3 knocks at the front door. I looked at my watch. Midnight. On the dot. Strange. I went to the front door, looked through the peephole. Nothing. No one. A series of likely scenarios ran through my mind. Maybe it was a kid playing Ding Dong Ditch. But then, why didn't they ring the doorbell? I unlocked the front door and pulled it open slowly. There, on the worn welcome mat, was a newspaper. At least, that's what it looked like to me. Slowly, tentatively, I picked it up with 2 fingers, like it was covered in something toxic. It was entirely black, both the paper and the strings binding it into a roll. Then, I made the worst mistake of my life. I took it inside. I sat at my dad's office desk with a knife from the kitchen. I used it to cut the knots on the black strings, and the newspaper unrolled itself slowly. It was thin, really only 1 page in length. There, on the only page, written in blocky white letters, were the words, "The Midnight Paper." This was the headline on the page, and the story written below it. Living and dying on the ledge. Urban legend or dangerous social media challenge? You may not have heard about it, but your kids have. There's a strange building on the edge of town. It's around 15 stories tall, and its rooftop holds a terrifying secret. The tenants know the story all too well. Last December, a girl, whose name this publication has chosen not to publish, attempted to take her own life by jumping off the rooftop and into the cold asphalt approximately 150 feet below. A tragic event, but unfortunately not too uncommon. But if you believe the word in online forums and instant messages, this was no ordinary suicide attempt. Not because of the circumstances leading up to it, but because of what happened when the girl climbed over the railing separating safe rooftop concrete and fatal plunge. As soon as the girl lifted 1 foot off the edge, something strange happened. A series of images bombarded her mind. It was her father, crying in her bedroom, surrounded by his daughter's belongings. Then it was her funeral. All her friends in suits and dresses, with grief and pain racking their faces. Then it was her own body, what was left of it. Twisted and broken and bloated and covered in stitches, yet still crammed into a dress. The girl put her foot back on the edge, shocked out of her fatal decision. But then, for some reason, she lifted her foot once more. The images came back, but this time they were different. It was her wearing a graduation gown. It was her in a college dorm. It was her with a boy. She hopped back over the railing and took the stairs down. The way down. The safe way down. She told a friend, who mockingly told another friend. That friend told a few others. You know the rest. Someone posted it online, and soon the internet ran with it. That building became a million others, in a million different towns. And for some reason, people started trying it out. They'd go out in groups to play with what soon became known as the ledge game. If you stood on the edge of a rooftop, on the wrong side of the railing, and stuck one foot out, you could see your own future. One such group decided to try the game out, with disastrous consequences. One of the girls in the group chose to go first. She climbed over the railing, stuck one foot out, and soon regretted it. Her friends say she started screaming, her eyes wide and looking off into the distance as if seeing something horrifying. Then, those eyes turned to look at her group of friends. She tried to grab one of them, as if trying to pull them over the railing with her, to take them with her as she fell. There was a funeral, with crying friends and a closed casket, much like the first girl saw. Instead of dissuading other teens from trying the game out, this news soon became an urban legend in its own right, growing into an indispensable part of the original tale. But there's something many people can't stop thinking about. What did that girl see? Whatever it was bad enough for her to ignore the visions of her own funeral and her own mangled body. Whatever it was bad enough for her to try to take her own friend's life, too. Some people say it was to spare her a fate worse than death. Maybe we'll never know. Or maybe, like in some versions of the story, we'll all know soon enough. Because the girl was pointing at the sky before she leapt, as if she could see something that nobody else could. That was the only story on the only page of the midnight paper. I wanted to know more, to know who wrote it, who published it, who delivered it. And I knew, like a piece of intoxicating, dangerous knowledge, that all I had to do to know more was wait for the next edition to hit the welcome mat. And I'll come back here to tell you all what it says. Quite a strange game to play, don't you think? I can't wait to see what happens next with this paper. Until next time, try to stay away from the ledge. Good evening, my October ghouls, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. Tonight, we present a tale of a neighborhood that seems to have lost control of its pumpkins. We now present My Neighborhood Has Turned Into a Pumpkin Patch. In the town of Dellen, where it's always cozy and nice, we never celebrate Halloween. Each year, on the 31st of October, our streets turn eerily quiet as nobody likes to give the impression that it is a day of importance. You will not hear the laughter of children going trick-or-treating. There is no anticipation of finding the scariest costume, and there will not be deadly decorations on any of the suburban houses. It goes even as far that we are strictly forbidden to mention the holiday out loud. Now, don't get me wrong, we do enjoy autumn. Dellen is quite beautiful during this season. Bright brown and red leaves embellish the streets with the occasional cracked up chestnut in between. The air is just cold enough to make your breath visible. When you walk through the streets, the smell of fire rising from the individual chimneys make you long for the warmth of your home. We enjoy autumn. We simply skip and don't acknowledge what the rest of the country gets ready for when the calendar reads October. When I was even younger than now, I never understood what was so terribly bad about this holiday as to forbid it altogether. The people in our town weren't particularly religious or conservative in any way. We celebrated every other holiday in the most cheerful manner, and I could even swear I once found a photo of my own mother dressed like a skeleton. It seemed unfair to me that apparently there was a time in which they enjoyed the season fully. Now it was the dullest time of year. When I'd secretly watch a Halloween movie while my parents were away, I would get incredibly frustrated, as it was plainly obvious that Dellen had just the perfect atmosphere for the season. And the atmosphere only got more fitting when the pumpkins arrived. Well, they didn't simply arrive overnight, even if it almost feels that way. Their seeds must have been planted months ago, everywhere in the neighborhood where there was any soil to grow. In front yards of homes, on the grass inside the roundabouts, and of course on the fields near school. Everywhere you went, you would see the green plants making their way out of the dirt. At first, we weren't entirely sure what exactly was growing there. Nobody minded though. It was rather nice to see all this green as the weather slowly becomes colder. And then, finally, the first hints of orange were showing. Tiny little pumpkins getting bigger each day. There were probably a dozen showing from the window of our kitchen alone. You know, in my prime, pranks looked a little different than that, my father laughed as we both looked outside on the first morning of October. You think it was a prank? Now, I haven't heard of the neighborhood committee planning anything like this, so I assume it was some bored teenagers. Were you possibly involved, Charlie? He winked at me. I shook my head. I kinda like it though. Maybe we could bring one inside? I carefully asked. There was nothing wrong with pumpkins after all. We had used them before for soup or pie, though they never looked quite like these. Usually, Dad would get butternut squash, or those green ones. The one I had my eyes on, however, had just the perfect size and form for carving a nasty face inside. Of course, I couldn't mention my intentions to my parents. Maybe we could make some pie late. I stopped speaking as I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. It was Mom's hand. Her face looked even paler than usual, and she had a worried look in her eyes. She had been so silent, I didn't even hear her approach.
"They are multiplying,"
she whispered. Dad chuckled a little. "Susie, they're just pumpkins. They've been growing for a while now. It has nothing to do with..." He stopped speaking as the ice-cold stare of my mother instructed him to. She shook her head and seemed all warm and friendly again. "Come on, honey. You should get going. School's about to start." Pumpkins became the #1 conversation item in our town. Some neighbors were wary of the so-called prank, just like my mother. Perhaps as it reminded them of the forbidden holiday. Most, however, seemed delighted by the gift of autumn. It didn't take long until the first ones started to harvest the pumpkins before they would start to ripen and mold. Mrs. Fendley, the old lady that lived opposite to us, had taken all of the ones that were growing in front of her house. When she opened the door, a sweet smell would escape, and her porch was decorated with different-sized pumpkins. I begged my mother to do the same. We didn't even have to carve them, but every time I even brought up the subject, her face would darken, and she would distract from the subject. Dad had given up as well, and so we started ignoring the pumpkins. My parents stopped caring about the subject altogether, or so it seemed, but it wasn't just our street that had turned full of them. They were all around our little town. Restaurants started using the flesh of the vegetables in new dishes. There were hot and even cold drinks created with them. And the small candy store in town even started making pumpkin caramels. They were omnipresent. I didn't want to disobey my mother. For some reason, this whole situation was turning her a little strange. And she was even more strict than usual. Still, those were only pumpkins. They had nothing to do with Halloween, and I had a hard time going along with her weird and illogical ways. At home, I would not speak of it, but I happily accepted the candy sample me and my friend Ben got from the candy maker. It was unbelievably good. We even got some pumpkin biscuits at the bakery on our way back from school. As unusual as it sounds, a part of me believed that maybe they really would have an effect on me. Maybe something awful would happen to me, but of course, none of that came true. They were only pumpkins after all. I felt just as healthy and happy. My stomach was simply a little bit fuller. However, while I couldn't sense any difference in myself, there sure was something changing on our streets. I noticed the first time at night. It must have been past 2 a.m. when there were rattling noises coming from just outside my window. Next thing, I suddenly heard steps, accompanied by quiet laughter and giggling. My body and mind were heavy from sleep, and so it took me a moment to realize I was not dreaming. My body froze at the unusual sounds, but I told myself it had to be some drunk kids stumbling back home, although our street was normally so quiet that you'd hear your own breath. I slowly opened an eye, and I could swear I saw some light outside. It looked warm and bright, as if there were candles lit up. I closed my eyes again and told myself to go back to sleep, but I was too curious at that point. I climbed out of bed and tiptoed toward the window, making sure to stay down low. I peeked outside, but was surprised to see nobody on the streets. The only light was coming from the opposite side of the street, Mrs. Findley's home. I found it quite unusual that she was awake at this time of night at all, but then I noticed that she wasn't inside. She was hunched down in our front yard with a knife in her hand. She was cutting off a pumpkin, the one I had my eyes on the other day. And then, out of nowhere, she moved her head up to where I was standing. I was inside a dark room. There is no way she saw me, but I could swear I felt her eyes pierce through me. I always found Mrs. Findlay rather scary. She was mean and used to shout at me and my friends whenever we played outside. This was a whole new experience, however. I quickly ducked down and crawled back to bed. I closed my eyes and tried to forget what I had just witnessed. I didn't speak to my parents about what had happened and told myself it had been nothing but a strange dream. I almost forgot about it at all until there was a ring at the door. Without thinking, I went to the front and opened the door, only to be greeted by the yellow smile of Mrs. Findlay herself. In her hands, she was holding a hot pumpkin pie. "Hello, dear. I was baking all morning and thought I'd bring you some. It fits the season, doesn't it?" she said and winked at me. I didn't know what to respond, but luckily my mother had appeared behind me again. "Oh, what a lovely pie, Mrs. Findlay, though that wasn't necessary at all. You see, I'm actually quite allergic to pumpkin, but thank you anyway." She already had her hand at the door, ready to close it. I could tell Mum was trying to be polite, but she seemed even more freaked out than me. Maybe she had seen the same thing as me last night. "Oh, nonsense. Let your child and husband enjoy it then," she promptly responded. The pie did smell amazing, sweet and with just a dash of cinnamon. My mother hesitated, but Mrs. Findlay handed the tray over with such determinism that she had no other chance than to accept it. She then turned around and walked back to her home without another word. Mum shut the door and walked to the kitchen with the pie. She opened the trash can and threw it right away. "Do not talk to that woman again, understood?" she said toward me. I nodded. "Mum, what the hell is going on? I saw her last night outside. What did you see? Was it just her, or did you see anyone else?" she almost shouted. "Mum, what's going on? It was just her, getting a pumpkin." My mother sighed and tried to smile, but half her face was twitching. "From now on, and until November begins, you will not leave this house when the sun goes down, understood? I'm gonna drive to the shop and get some supplies. Stay here and wait for your dad, all right?" She didn't even wait for my answer. I had no idea what was going on with her, but she wouldn't listen to any of my questions, and basically stormed out of the door. Mum wasn't back until the afternoon when the sun was slowly starting to set. It seemed she had talked to my dad, however, because as soon as she was inside, they started preparing our home. They put locks on all windows and doors and put dark fabric over all of our windows. "What is happening? Can you please talk to me?" I almost cried. I had never seen my parents this way. I felt like they were surely losing their minds. "Listen, Charlie, there's a reason we never celebrate this month at Dellen. It's because when we do, there is someone else joining us. Someone we do never want to see," my father whispered. "Seems someone invited them to come back, honey. But don't worry, they'll be gone again soon." That's all the information I got out of my parents. I had no idea what was going on. But after everything was finished, they went back to being almost normal. They cooked dinner. We sat by the table and talked about school, work, and all the other boring subjects. Every time I tried to bring up the oddness, they shut me right down. After dinner, We watched a movie in the living room. It was already quite late, and I was just about to go to bed when the noises were back. A rattling just outside. The sound of sticks breaking on the ground. Laughter. But this time, my parents heard it as well. Mum's eyes shot wide open. She had a finger to her lips, signaling me to be quiet. Even Dad seemed to be shaking. The noises came closer. This time, it couldn't possibly just be Mrs. Findlay. I heard different people giggling. They almost sounded like children. The sound was now right behind our door. First, there was scratching, and then a loud knock. And another one. And another one. We stayed quiet and still, but it wouldn't stop. Somebody was knocking at the windows now. I wanted to believe that it was just another prank, but from the face of my mother, I could tell that it was something much worse. I don't know how much time had passed when the noises finally stopped and I dared to speak again.
If you knew this would happen, why didn't we leave?
I asked. My mother had tears in her eyes when she answered.
Because we can't.
When morning arrived and my parents finally removed the fabrics from the windows, I couldn't believe what kind of stupidity they pulled into me last night. I was scared shitless at night, but now I couldn't understand what on earth they were thinking and ultimately believed that my parents were actually the ones screwing with me. Maybe they wanted to teach me a lesson because they could tell how much I wanted to celebrate Halloween. I got even angrier when I realized what the noises outside had been coming from last night. As I looked through the window to the other side of the street, Mrs. Findlay's house was unrecognizable. It was hauntingly beautiful and decorated just the way I always saw in movies. She had carved pumpkins all around, poisoned apples hanging in the trees, and spiderwebs stuck to the roof. There were gravestones on the lawn, and skulls assembled neatly all around the house. It must have taken her all night, though she did seem to have help. Or at least, that's where I assumed the other voices were coming from. Though the creepiest part was the witch hanging from a rope on her porch. It was dressed in all black with a big hat and a broom. I put on my shoes, grabbed my coat, and walked outside. I had never seen any home in Dellen being decorated like this, and it wasn't even officially Halloween yet. More neighbors had assembled and were watching the spooky home of Mrs. Findlay. As I got closer, I noticed that there was something sticky dripping from the witch's broom. It looked like blood. I slowly walked up the stairs to her porch, but instinctively took a step back when I realized that it didn't just look like blood. It was blood. And this witch wasn't holding a broom. The stick was pierced right through her hand. Finally, the other neighbors and I made the last realization. This wasn't a decorative witch hanging from a rope. It was Mrs. Findlay's dead body. Mrs. Findlay's house was the first, but not the last one to be decorated in the spirit of Halloween. My mother was right. This was the year in which we needed to stay inside because we had welcomed something to our town that was ready to feast. In the town of Dellen, where it's always cozy and nice, we never celebrate Halloween. But I guess this year is different. And what did we learn today, friends? Never live in Dillon. Until next time, carve all the pumpkins and eat all the pumpkin pie you want, unless you're from Dillon.
Greetings. I hope your evening is going well. Please have your tickets ready as we walk by. Tickets? Tickets, please. Right this way. This evening, I will be your gracious host. You can call me the Creeper. Welcome to Carnival X. Tonight's show is a collection of 5 tales born of the Halloween season. You will witness the perils of visiting abandoned haunted houses, having trick-or-treaters show up on the wrong day, getting lost in the Canadian wilderness, and even multiple tales about what happens when you get stuck working overnight on Halloween. Please step through this door to enter our first tent of the evening. In here, we will experience the story of a man tasked with running security in a graveyard on Halloween night. Our first story is called 9 Rules for the Night Shift on Halloween.
You sure you have all the rules memorized? My boss said as he gathered his belongings to go home. Yeah, sure thing. I got 'em all up here, I said as I pointed to my head. He gave me a nod and headed out the door of the small office to go home. My boss was a little off, to say the least. This was my first month as a security guard at a cemetery right around the corner from my residence, and I had just gotten out of college about 3 months ago. The last month of shifts had been boring, sitting around, checking cameras, and doing rounds through the cemetery, making sure nothing is out of order. Exciting, right? I needed a source of income, and this was the best paying job I could find. No real experience needed, the flyer said. My take was that they were desperate to find someone fast, so I took advantage of that. I was hired the day that I found the flyer, over the phone. I never even found out the guy's name. When I came in on my first day, my boss gave me no training, no do's and don'ts, just a verbal list of 9 rules I had to follow and memorize before Halloween night. These rules are to be followed only on Halloween night, he said. You must follow these rules the exact way they are told to you. If you mess up even a small part, well, you won't mess up, because I trust you to follow them word for word. I looked at him confused, because this sounded almost like a threat. Nevertheless, I pulled out my phone and started an audio recording so he could record the list. Once he finished telling me the rules, I was in absolute disbelief. This guy is insane. No wonder why no one wants to work here. This guy is actually insane, I thought to myself. I know every place has certain rules to follow, but to designate a set of rules, insane rules, for Halloween night only? I guess he won't know how I felt until I tell you the rules that he gave me, word for word. Exactly how he told me, straight from the recording. Rule number 1. On Halloween night, please arrive at 8:30 p.m. No earlier, no later. Do not walk in these doors until it reaches 8:30. For the love of God, please. Rule number 2. Stay inside the office until 9:15. Do not leave. Keep yourself occupied, but do not check the security cameras during this time. I'll make sure to turn them off before you get here, so there is no temptation to peek at them. This might be one of the most important rules. If the monitor turns on by itself, do not look either. If for some reason you look, and you see it has revealed the A section of the cemetery, you must turn off the lights of the office and hide. If it reveals the B or C section, and you look at it, your only option is to run. Good luck with this. To make this easier, just cover the monitor with a jacket or blanket, because you will not want to see what happens out here at this time on Halloween night. Rule number 3. After 9:15 strikes, you will have 30 seconds to get out of the office. Leave the door unlocked. It is possible you will pass an unnaturally tall figure with no facial features. This is not a Halloween costume, and you must tell him good evening and look at him right where his eyes would be. If he doesn't respond, continue on your way to patrol the cemetery. If he says anything at all, you must stand completely still. Do not move a muscle. He might walk around you, but if you keep still until he's done, he should walk away with no problem, go into the office and slam the door behind him. Rule number 4. You will make your way to Section A. Once you inspect Section A, you will realize the gravestone titled James R. Hackney is being dug up completely. This is not out of the ordinary. Do not, and I mean do not, pay any attention to what is inside the 6-foot hole in the ground. You will not see the rest of your shift if you look down in that hole. Just keep walking to Section B and do not look back. Rule number 5. As soon as you cross the bridge from Section A to B, you will notice about a dozen shadow-like figures standing around in a circle around the big oak tree to the left of the bridge. Please listen closely to what I'm about to say. You must find the figure wearing the black top hat. You will walk up behind him and ask, "Am I clear?" If you hear a voice from inside your head say, "Continue," then you can carry on to Section B. If you don't hear anything, you must wait. You can look over to the section at this time, but I recommend keeping your eyes down. Trust me. There will be no physical harm to you if you look, but I can't promise you will be emotionally intact after looking. Rule number 6. Once you get the go-ahead, continue on to Section B. You may walk around and do what you would normally do every night here. The only catch is you must stay in this section until 10 o'clock. It should be 9:30 to 9:45 by now, so you won't have to wait long. After the time crosses 10 o'clock, continue on. Rule number 7. After walking out of Section B, you will notice a strange temperature change and lighting change. The time will have jumped to 2 a.m. after crossing. Do not panic, and please do not answer your phone. Your phone will be ringing constantly. As soon as it starts ringing, you will stand still and not move until it stops. It will be calls from your mother, father, siblings, girlfriend, boyfriend, anything you can think of. You must not answer these calls. It is not actually them calling. It is, in fact, the man that you saw earlier. The one with no facial features. He is trying to lure you back into the office. You must stay away from that office until I tell you to go back. Your phone will stop ringing after about a half hour. which leaves you at around 2:30 a.m. You can continue on at this point. Rule number 8. You will notice another time jump. This one, 2 more hours from 2:30 to 4:30. If the time still says 2:30 after the calls stop, you are in trouble. Unfortunately, there is nothing you can do here. You messed up a step at some point if you end up here. You can, finally, finish your inspection of Section C. You must be prepared for a woman covered in blood to run up to you begging for help. She will be asking you where her baby is, and if you can come fast to help her. Do not be startled, no matter how loud she yells. Tell her you will meet her outside of the cemetery in 10 minutes, for her to wait there. She will run off in the opposite direction. And that's how you know you succeeded. There will be a lot of towels and rags all over the ground covered in blood around Section C. This is the only maintenance you will have to do. Just pick them up and dispose of them in the waste bin closest to you. Rule number 9. After completing this final task, you must run back to your office. Do not look anywhere but ahead of you. You will see figures everywhere. You will hear your name being called from voices that you think you recognize. Just keep running. Once you reach the office, you will see the faceless man leaving the office building. It should be 5 a.m. at this point. He will stop you and either say, "Good work," and nod at you, or, "Come with me." If he says, "Good work," you will slowly walk into the office and close the door. For the remainder of the shift, you can check the cameras, sit down, and go on with your shift until I come inside to start my shift. If he says, "Come with me," you will run and lock yourself in the office. Do not fall for his calm, monotone voice. He is anything but calm if you mess up. Do not let him in, and wait for him to stop banging on the door. Once this stops, cover your eyes for the last hour of your shift. Don't look around until you hear 3 knocks on the door. This will be me to relieve you of your shift. You won't be called in for a few weeks to come to terms with what you have seen, and you will be paid a handsome amount of money for your duties. Now that you have listened to the rules as well, I hope you can understand my initial suspicion and why I was so baffled. I thought this was a joke until I finished my shift. After my boss left at 9:30, I decided I was going to just follow the rules given to me to humble him and be a good sport of the prank. I didn't check the cameras, and I headed out the door. After going outside, the brisk fall air hit me as I saw a tall man walking up to me. I looked at him, and he was actually faceless. It looked so real and kind of gave me the creeps. I almost forgot to tell him, "Good evening." He looked at me. Well, I think he did, and continued on through the door. I shivered a little as I headed on straight to Section A. I arrived at the entrance, and I searched for James R. Hackney's grave, a grave I always saw, as it was the biggest one there. To my disbelief, it was actually being dug up. I felt sick to my stomach that they would go this far to scare me, so I hurried past the grave as a wave of uneasiness came over me. This can't be real, I assured myself as I headed across the bridge to Section B. I scanned for the oak tree, and when I finally found it, I noticed the figures my boss warned me about. I instantly spotted the one with the top hat. I unsteadily scurried over to him and asked, "Am I clear?" No answer. I stood there, waiting for an answer that never came. I decided to look away from the man and peek over to Section B, because surely the pranksters wanted me to look, since they warned me against it. I froze and felt pins and needles in my hands as I saw myself standing there in the distance. At least, what looked like me, except I was taller and covered in blood. As the figure that presumably was me stared back, it let out a screech and started running toward me. I was startled and absolutely mortified by this, and turned around to run. I looked back, and as it reached its arms out, it completely vanished. As soon as it vanished, I heard a voice from within my head say, "Continue." At this point, I had a million thoughts running through my head as I started to realize whatever was happening was somehow impossibly real, and I felt my mind switch from confused to defensive. I inspected the area until 10 p.m., constantly looking over my shoulder. I checked my phone and saw it was time to move to Section 3. I felt exactly what I was told, a temperature change, and saw the surroundings get just a little bit darker. It was noticeably colder. No way, I told myself as I reached for my phone, which displayed 2 a.m. Before I could form another thought, my phone rang right on cue and stopped dead in my tracks. "Dad," the phone displayed. I stared back at the phone as I looked at those 3 letters. I never knew my dad, and definitely never had him saved in my phone. I felt a tear form in my eye, because this was a very sensitive topic to me. I'd let it ring as I got lost in a trance of thinking about how on earth any of this was even possible. The ringing finally stopped, and I let out a sigh of relief. I remembered the next rule about the time and opened my phone again. 2:30. I kept moving on with some stray tears in my eyes, watching my phone turn from 2:30 to 4:30. This was a relief to me, because now that I knew this was somehow real, I realized I have done all the steps right so far. As I started inspecting Section 3 with cold fingers and numb toes, I heard screaming. Naturally, this scared the hell out of me, and I jumped out of my shoes. I snapped my head around to a blood-covered woman screaming, "My baby! I can't find my baby!" I told her. After a bit of hesitation, I told her to meet me at the entrance of the cemetery in 10 minutes. She nodded and ran off, and I noticed a ton of blood-covered rags all over the ground. Shaken up by her screams, I slowly picked up the rags and threw them out. I looked around and ran back to the office. The whole run, I didn't see anyone and didn't hear anything, which was weird because my boss said otherwise. I'll count my blessings here though, and find myself in front of the office finally. The man was leaving. This time, I looked at him in complete terror as he turned my way and said, "Come with me." I wasted no time running past him, into the office, and slamming the door behind me. "What did I mess up?" I yelled over the sound of banging on the door as I pulled a jacket over my head. I shivered in fear for the entire hour until I heard 3 knocks on the door. I shot up, threw the door open, and yelled, "What the hell did you just put me through?" I was mad, although relieved to see him, who looked a lot more colorful and lifelike than he has in the past. He looked at me and smiled at me. "Go home, kid. Get some sleep." I yelled back, "No, I want answers. You cannot just tell me to go after the night I just had." He looked at me and said,
You took care of my cemetery, kid. I thank you for that.
He held out his hand for a handshake.
The name is James Ryan Hackney, and I've been dead for 200 years. Every Halloween, I leave the cemetery and recharge so my physical body does not perish. You covered me last night, and I thank you for that.
It didn't take me long to recognize his name as the name on the gravestone that was dug up. I stared back at him, mouth wide open, speechless. I walked out of that door, packed my house up, and never came back to this town again.
Well, that certainly did not go in the direction that I thought it would. Can you imagine finding out that your boss has been dead for 200 years? Please follow me to the second tent. Through this door, we will learn to pay extra attention to the calendar and make sure that we're only feeding trick-or-treaters on the night of Halloween. Our next story is called Every Night is Halloween.
To his dismay, the storm cellar doors were wide open again. He didn't remember opening them, but there they were, propped open as big as day. There wasn't anyone else around who could have done it. He was alone in the big old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. As much as he didn't want to accept it, Harold realized he was getting forgetful in his old age. Hopefully no wild animals took advantage of the opportunity for shelter and ran down into the closed-off basement, he worried. They'd be trapped there once the doors were closed again. The possibility of that happening was quite reasonable. It had been cold the past few mornings. In order to allow any curious critter a chance to escape, Harold left them open for a while and went about his morning chores. That afternoon, he crept down the rickety steps with a flashlight to make sure it was empty. After shining it around the piles of old furniture and damp keepsakes, he was satisfied it was abandoned. Then he shut the doors tightly and weighted them down with a cinder block. Late that evening, there was an unexpected knock on his front door. Harold rose from his easy chair to see who'd come calling so close to darkness. He never had any visitors. When he opened the screen, he was greeted by a startling sight. There was a ghoul, a hobgoblin, and 2 other frightful creatures on his front porch. Without saying a word, they each held out a silken handkerchief. Harold didn't know what to make of it at first. His heart pounded at the fearful sight of the savage-looking creatures. Then he remembered that it was late October. Halloween, he realized with a grin. It had been so long since any kids had came to his remote farmhouse that he forgot all about the kiddie holiday. Luckily, he happened to have some candy in the pantry. He told the spooky little tykes to wait on the porch, and he would be right back with their treats. He was a little startled to see that they were so anxious for the candy that they came into his house uninvited. They also didn't call out the traditional trick-or-treat greeting. Where were these kids' parents, he wondered. For all they knew, he might be a kidnapper or a pervert. Hopefully they were waiting just down the hill by the mailbox. He gave each of them a generous handful of candy, which seemed to satisfy them. Regardless, he didn't receive a single thank you. The candy bandits silently turned and left into the night, leaving him to wonder about the lack of manners in the younger generation. About the only thing which impressed him was their costumes. They were amazingly lifelike. Back in his day, he only had a plastic mask with a rubber band. Back inside, he sat down and started reading his newspaper again. He was very confused to see that the date on the byline was October the 29th. He assumed a mailman had delivered an old paper, but his desk calendar confirmed it. It was actually 2 days before Halloween. The visitors to his front porch and their true purpose remained a complete mystery. The next morning, Harold was grieved to see that the storm doors were open again. He immediately thought of the impolite candy extortionists from the night before. The weight of the cinder block should have been too much for them, but clearly it wasn't. Those kids were far too small to remove the block and lift those heavy doors. He ran down the steps to confront the trespassers, whoever they were. Once again, the dank cellar seemed to be free of unauthorized occupants, but there were telltale candy wrapper signs on the floor. The exact same candy he'd given them the previous night. Harold's blood boiled. Either they, or their stronger, unseen family members were violating the sanctity of his home. He made sure the cellar was vacant again, and then barricaded both doors with a chain through the handles. While that countermanded the necessity of quick access to the cellar in the event of a storm, he wanted to send a clear message to the trespassers. He would not tolerate squatters or vagrants living in his home. Around sundown, Harold heard a loud splintering sound disturb the evening silence. At first, he assumed it was a falling limb in the woods behind his home and thought nothing of it. Less than a minute later, however, there came another knock on his front door. He sprang up and jerked it open in anticipation of a fiery, still unknown conflict. Regardless, he could hardly believe what he witnessed. The same rogues gallery of spooky munchkins were there, waiting with outstretched handkerchiefs.
"Where are your parents?" he demanded. "Do they know about your vandalism and trespassing in my cellar? I guess I'll have to call the police if your parents don't come forward immediately. This isn't a joke."
The four diminutive guests on the front porch remained utterly silent. Meanwhile, they continued to hold out their goodie bags for more treats. Harold was incensed at their brazen audacity. "How dare you stand there demanding more from me while trespassing in my home?" His face was white with rage. He reached over to pull off the mask of the nearest ghoul, but got a startling shock. It wouldn't come off. As he tugged insistently on the top of the costume to force the child to face him personally, the little devil began to growl at him fiercely. After a half-dozen yanks, it was obvious that it was attached. He let go and grabbed another child's mask, with the same result. The four half-pint goblins bared impressive, real fangs as they snarled at him. As soon as he came to terms with the chilling reality of inhuman creatures on his porch, he accepted that while they weren't human, they did like sweets. He excused himself to retrieve the bags of candy before he met up with their unseen parents. It was obvious that they were all dwelling somewhere in the bowels of his storm cellar. He made a mental note to always leave the storm doors unlocked, and to pick up more candy at the store. He had to maintain their unspoken truce at all costs. He shuddered at the thought of running out. Apparently, every night was going to be Halloween now.
Ladies and gentlemen, if that were my house, I would not be heading to the candy store. I would be heading to the local realtor's office to find a new home. But for now, let us head this way toward tent number 3. In here, we find out what happens when you trick or treat at the house with no lights. Please enjoy our next story, titled simply, Haunted House.
I do my best to not look. A slight tremor in my hands as I approach the edge of the dried and yellow lawn. Pulling up to the curb, I put my old '96 pickup truck into park outside of the old house. Slowly, I inhale a deep breath and look to my right, out the passenger side window. Standing there, menacingly, is a decrepit 3-story house. The outside of the building is painted a deep brown, the paint chipping here and there, the exterior walls covered in ivy. The black shingles have been gradually falling off of the roof for years now, making the housetop look like the salt and pepper hair of a man rapidly approaching middle age. The lawn is yellow and coarse, a stark contrast from the green and vibrant lawns that surround it. On the old wooden porch of the house sat an old scarecrow, lounging casually in a piece of outdoor furniture. This particular house has haunted me for a decade now. When I was only 12 years old, I got persuaded by my older brother, 17 at the time, to come to this house at 106 West Amsterdam Lane in the dead of night on October 30th, the night before Halloween. Cloaked in a cover of darkness, we came to the house prepared with nothing but flashlights, a pack of spearmint bubblegum, and our mother's pepper spray that we had stolen out of her bag. The house had looked the same then as it does now. Curtains in the windows torn and dusty, the front porch shrouded in spider webs, the garden an indecipherable concoction of dried, dead plants. We walked up to the front door, exchanging nervous glances. I remember hiding behind my older brother, ashamed of how scared I was. It was just a house after all. What was there to be afraid of? Oh, if only I had known. My brother knocked on the door 3 times in rapid succession. There was no response at first, as we waited in the chilly autumn evening, clinging tightly to our denim jackets and hoodies for warmth. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, we could hear a faint scratching on the other side of the door. My brother called out in a voice soaked in mock confidence, "Trick or treat!" This made me nervous. Whoever lived here was sure to know that it wasn't actually Halloween yet, They were sure to know that we were up to no good. But it was too late. The words had been spoken, and as soon as they escaped my brother's lips, the scratching had stopped. After only a moment, we could hear the deadbolt on the door come unlocked with a loud clunk. I felt my hands begin to turn clammy, and a lump form in my throat. What were we doing? Couldn't we get in trouble for this? Before I had the chance to change my mind, the door to the house slowly swung away from us. It was dark in the entryway of the house, and we couldn't see who or what had been scratching on the other side of the door. There was no warmth radiating from inside the home, which was unusual considering how cold it was outside.
Trent, I don't know about this,
I whispered, catching a hold of my older brother's sleeve.
It's fine, Justin,
was all he said in response before shrugging me off of him and walking through the door. Before I even got the chance to rebuttal, he was in the door, and the door was slammed shut.
No!
I screamed, throwing myself at the door and pounding on it with my bare fists.
Trent!
That was the last time I ever saw my brother. His disappearance was considered a closed case when the cops found a mysterious note in his room saying that he had run away with a girlfriend and didn't intend on coming back. I knew this was ridiculous. Not only had Trent and I been close, despite our age gap, and I would have known if he had such plans, but I also witnessed his disappearance right before my very eyes. But of course, no one believed me. And now, here I am, sitting in my truck out in front of the very house that took my brother from me all of those years ago, shaking from fear. This isn't some sort of bravery stunt, not some half-baked revenge plan to get my brother back. I'm only a pizza delivery guy. I was assigned to come over to this particular house. When I saw the address on the ticket, my heart sank into my stomach. Maybe someone new had moved in? Maybe it had all been in my imagination all those years ago? Regardless, here I am, pizza in hand, ready to face the house that's been haunting me for the past decade. I open the door to my truck and swing my legs out. I slowly approach the house, my knees shaking and my forehead growing sweaty. I knock 3 times.
Friends, a big tip for a pizza delivery is simply not worth disappearing over. You want a tip? Learn from your mistakes the first time. Follow me this way toward tent number 4. Here, we will spend the night with an employee of a museum who gets stuck working on Halloween night. And, just like another one of our stories, he gets stuck with some strange rules to follow. Our next tale is titled, Taking the Halloween Shift Was the Worst Mistake of My Life.
I am a 22-year-old tall and muscular male. I needed money and found a job as a security guard in the local museum. But this was not an ordinary museum. It was a religion museum, filled with various objects from various religions. From photos to different prayers, the museum had everything a religious man could think of. It was very eerie, especially at night. It even had some real-size wax figures with different characters. I do not think you understand how it feels to walk past some wax Jesus at 3 a.m. who is staring right into your soul. I took the night shift because it was quiet and because I would just lock myself in the security room, watching the cameras or playing games on the main computer. Yes, this museum had more computers. My first few shifts were normal. The only creepy thing that happened was when my cup suddenly fell, only to discover that a rat made its way into the security room. Halloween was approaching, and I took the shift. Taking the Halloween shift was the worst mistake of my life. Why, you may ask? When I entered my shift, the supervisor was waiting for me. He told me to check the night shift rules. But I check them daily, I know them, I said. No, you don't know the Halloween rules. What do you mean? Just check them. This gave me chills, because my supervisor was a sweetheart and would joke every time. Not this time. I just entered the security room, and like usual, I locked the door and started playing some Fallout 4. Some hours pass, and I forgot to check the rules. I remembered to check them when some NPC told me I broke the rules. I just paused the game, enter the desktop screen, and open the PDF named Night Shift Rules Halloween. As I start to read, a feeling of cold sticks to me. Nothing was eerie or thrilling in the rules. Yet, I start reading, and everything was the same. But after the last rule, I observed that there is more. That's when the creepy stuff started coming. You need to follow every rule as your life depends on it, because it really does. Check the cameras as much as you can. Make sure that after the clock strikes midnight, your door is locked. You pull the blinds and block the vent with the wardrobe. That's when I jumped. I pulled the blinds, I blocked the vent, then triple-checked the door. I turned the floor heating on and removed my shoes to move quietly. I've seen a lot of bullshit, but the tone my supervisor had, the museum itself, and the feeling of cold that struck me when I opened the PDF, this felt way too real. As I quietly go to the computer, I keep on reading. Number 4. As you may already suspect, you are not allowed to leave the room. You have everything you need to survive until daylight. When I heard survive, my pants got brown really quick. Will I die? Is this some sort of sick joke, and I am that dumb to believe it? Anyway, I had to read everything. If you smell things that are not there, or hear things that are not there, like goats, prayers, whispers, etc., it's normal. If you are quiet, everything should be fine. That's all, Mr. Green. Good night, and good luck. I was scared, almost hyperventilating, but I sucked it up and calmed down. I rechecked the door, the blinds, and the wardrobe. Right as I finish and put my butt back on the chair, I hear a loud clock noise. It struck midnight. The game started. I was staring at the cameras like a weirdo. I eventually fell asleep, but don't you think I slept like a log? It was the lightest and most fragile sleep I've ever had. I woke up at 2:22 a.m. when I heard something like a crack of knuckles. It felt like that sound was coming right from behind me, but I didn't have the balls to look. I started hearing whispers. I was smelling blood, so I turned around. Nothing was there. I was happy that nothing was there, but my happiness faded when I heard glass being broken. I checked the cameras, and I saw it. 4 tall things, I don't know if they were human or not, broke a window and took out a ritualic doll. I zoomed on the person holding the doll, and I forgot about the fact that zooming with a camera makes sound. The tall creatures looked at the camera and waved to it. I could see no facial traits, but I could hear them mumble something. I was scared, but curious in the same time. I almost fell in a trance, but I was reality checked by life when I heard loud bangs on the door. I then hid in the wardrobe, peeking through the small crack between the doors. The bangs came and came and came for what felt like hours. I sent a message to my best friend, Jake, and told him everything. But as I thought, he was sleeping. I had no one. I was afraid. I started hearing whispers.
Prepare for death, Toby. They are almost there. They will feast on your blood.
These phrases were constantly whispered in my head. Was I going nuts? I sat there, silently, paralyzed by fear. Then the bangs stopped. The roosters started to sing. I checked the clock on my phone, and it was 8 a.m. Sweet Mother of God, it was 8 a.m. I then deleted the message I sent to Jake, just because then I would have to explain everything to him, and patiently waited for the guy to come to the day shift. I was browsing Reddit, and then bangs start again. I was beyond scared, until I heard the day shift guy yelling at me to get out because his shift started. I quietly got out and never told him what happened. As I go home, I lay in bed, ready to get some good sleep, when I heard another whisper.
Last night, it was just the beginning. Have these people not learned a thing about working on Halloween night? On to our final tent of the evening. Within this tent, you will witness fear that goes beyond being lost in the freezing cold Canadian wilderness. Please enjoy our final story of the evening. This one is called, If You Hear the Mummers Calling, Stay Inside.
Alright, so when I was a teenager, back in Labrador, I got stranded out in the snow. I was out there feeding our sled dogs since we kept them on an island when they weren't in service. My snowmobile broke down and I tried to restart it and flooded the engine. I spent 2 hours trying to start it again, but then gave up and realized it was hopeless. The thing was frozen solid. It was that cold. I ended up out there for 2 nights. When I realized the first night that the sun was going down and I was going to be stranded out there, I remembered my uncle's advice. He told me I should start by making a shelter. So I dug down into the snow, about 2 or 3 feet, and made a cave. Then I grabbed some pine boughs and laid those down inside to keep it warm for the night. By the time it got dark, I was so fucking cold. I didn't think it was possible to be so cold, but I got through the night somehow. What did I eat? Nothing. I was starving. There was nothing to eat out there. I spent the whole second day hungry and terrified, just waiting for someone to come and save me. Then after that, just waiting for the sun to go down, waiting to be cold again. The snowmobile still wouldn't start. The engine had been flooded and was frozen solid as an ice cube. The sun went down again, and I was so fucking terrified, just waiting for death to come. I really thought I wasn't going to make it. I started my second night alone, freezing cold in the Labrador wilderness, only a snow cave for shelter. So I'm laying there in my little cave of pine boughs and, well, I guess I should tell you this first. I never believed in the mummers when my family told me about them as a kid. Inuit spirits and legends, I didn't buy into them at all. They used to bug me for it. There was even a ceremony where they would pretend to beat up kids with sticks for not believing in spirits. So it was kind of a big deal that I didn't believe in those things. But either way, I didn't. Something must have stuck with me though, because of how I reacted next. I heard what sounded like my mom and sister outside my hole in the snow. They were calling to me, telling me it was safe to come out now. They had found me, and I was rescued. I heard that at first, and was about to jump up and go running out there. But then I stayed put, suddenly remembering the stories about the mummers. These creatures that take on the voices of those closest to us and lure us away from safety, taking us with them into the cold ocean. They prey especially on children who stray too far away from the safety of their parents. They take on their voices and lure them away by calling out to them in the voices of those most familiar to them. I didn't move, remembering what my uncle and my mother had told me. I stayed inside my little snow cave for the rest of the night, shivering, waiting for them to go away. But they kept calling to me, saying, "Andy, what are you doing? We're waiting for you out here. Why don't you come with us? We just want to take you back home." They stayed out there all night, and I didn't sleep for a long time, as I listened to them call my name, coaxing and begging me to join them. When I woke up the next day, there was no one there. I was rescued later that same day by my uncle. My family believed what happened, saying now I couldn't doubt the legends any longer. But they told me never to speak of that day. I can't really remember why, though. I just finished typing this out. As I finished writing it, though, I heard a voice calling to me from outside my living room window. It sounded like my mom. But what was she doing outside my apartment building at 2 a.m.?
Hey, Andy, can you come down here? It's really important.
I stood on trembling legs and walked over to the glass. In the darkness below, I saw a figure, a woman, standing in the grass. She was soaking wet, long black hair hanging down and dripping, covering her face. I don't think I'll sleep tonight. She calls out again and again. Maybe I shouldn't share this story after all.
I guess that one will give you a good excuse for ignoring your family members, won't it? Thank you for spending your evening with us, my friends. Be sure to come back soon for more tales from the pumpkin patch. On your way out, please remember to monster mash the subscribe button and click the little Franken chime next to it. This will ensure that you are alerted by the elder gods of YouTube when we present our next set of tales. Until next time, I think I hear my grandmother's voice calling me, which is a bit strange, as she's been dead for 10 years.
Good evening, my Halloween friends, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. 'Tis the season for parties and masquerades among the living, the dead, and the undead, all of who are welcome to have a good time. Well, almost all. Put on your headphones, turn out the lights, and enjoy tonight's tale, the simply and aptly titled Halloween Party.
Come on, Jess. If you're not in the car in the next minute, we're leaving you here.
Tommy hollered from just outside my bedroom door. I knew he, Becca, John, and Terry were waiting for me. We were all about to head to Hannah's massive Halloween extravaganza, She was the most popular girl in school, and everyone was going to be at this party.
Look, Tommy, spandex isn't the easiest thing to just slip on. I'll be there as soon as I can.
I yelled back, struggling to get my costume on. I was going as Harley Quinn, Tommy was Bane, Becca was Poison Ivy, John was Batman, and Terry was Wonder Woman.
Yeah, well, Becca had no trouble getting hers on. Hurried up in there,
he retorted. And with that, I heard shuffling as he walked away toward the car. I managed to pull the costume all the way on, grabbed my coat and other necessities, and headed out toward the car myself. Everyone was inside and waiting when I finally came out.
Hey babe,
I said as I slid in next to Becca and gave her a peck on the cheek. She returned the favor. We hit the road around 7 for what was about to be just over an hour's drive, which would include a stretch of cornfields where there was no life around for miles. I always hated going through that stretch of road, but that was life in rural Nebraska, and I had lived it for 18 years now. The drive went smooth for the first 25 or so minutes. We drank some of the beer John had taken from his dad's stash, and were all together having a great time. Then, the engine sputtered, and next thing we knew, the car completely stopped. Tommy and John tried to fix it, but it was completely shot. We all checked our phones, but no one had signal. The closest civilization was a near 2 to 3 hour walk. We were stuck in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless corn and empty street. That was, until we saw, just down the road, the top of a farmhouse. We all made our way there and begged the owner for help. He let us in, but let us know we wouldn't be getting a tow truck until morning, with it being Halloween night and this being miles from town. And we still had no signal, and the closest motel was also a couple of hours' walk away. So, he offered up his 2 spare rooms for us to spend the night in. And with no other feasible options, we agreed. His house was beautiful and extremely well kept. He said his name was Larry, and he's lived alone for the last 5 years since his wife passed. He rarely had visitors since his kids nearly never came to visit, and he was so far from town, so he was somewhat excited to have us over. Becca and I took one of the rooms, Terry and Tommy the other, and John got to stay on the couch. We all settled in and got ready to spend the night in a widowed farmer's house who we'd never met before. This was about to be the weirdest Airbnb ever, is all I could think. Larry had us all meet in the living room a little later. It was nearing 10 now. He warned us to stay in the house no matter what tonight, and to absolutely not answer the door. We hesitantly agreed, since it was either we follow his rules and stay in the warm house, or spend the night in the car. Larry said he'd be going out to the shed for a while to take care of some stuff, and that we should start heading to bed. We did just that, and all made our way to our rooms, save for John, who was sprawled out on the couch and passed out nearly immediately. Becca and I, however, couldn't sleep at all. We sat up discussing the weirdness of the situation. Eventually, she managed to soothe me to sleep and soon fell asleep herself. I imagine Terry and Tom either fell asleep or stayed up all night. Either way, we were all together in the hall when we heard an ear-splitting scream from outside, from the shed. We rushed to the back of the house and looked out of the window. We barely had sight into the shed, but it was enough for us to see Larry collapse with a gardening tool jammed in his head. We all shrieked in horror, some more manly than others. Tommy would have wanted me to add that. Tom took the lead as we made our way back to the front to try to get the hell out of there before whoever killed the farmer came for us. We all grabbed the closest things to weapons we could find to be safe, and Tom reached to open the front door. It swung open, and all that was there was a scarecrow.
"What kind of sick joke is this?"
were Tommy's last words as he reached to move the scarecrow out of the way. As he grabbed it, it grabbed back. Then it raised its free hand, which held a gardening trowel. It then shoved said trowel down Tom's throat. The rest of us booked it for the back door. We froze short as we looked out the window and saw the house being surrounded by the murderous crop protectors.
"Holy shit, we are so fucked,"
Becca said in a panicked voice I'd never heard from her before.
"They're just scarecrows, right? Can't be that hard to take them out and clear a path,"
I said, trying to sound reassuring. And like I believed what I was saying. That facade faded fast with John's next words.
"Jess, do you see how many of them are there? Plus, the car's dead, and there's no town for almost 20 miles. Even if we clear a path, where in the hell are we gonna go?"
He was right. I didn't want to admit it, but he clearly was. There were at least 20 to 30 of them, easily, and only 4 of us, dressed like DC Comics characters. What a way to go out, I thought to myself.
"Well, there's gotta be something we can do. We can't just sit here and die. Doesn't Larry have any kind of vehicle?"
Desperation began creeping into my voice, and I knew it.
"He said his truck is messed up like ours. He just rarely goes to town, so he isn't worried about fixing it. But maybe there's a tractor out there. That would work if we can get past them. Keys are probably in the shed. I'll open the back door and we can book it and try to chop any down that come for us."
This was when we finally realized the scarecrow from the front door had nearly cleared the space between us and the door. We booked it out back, John in front and Terry bringing up the rear. The plan went well for the first few yards. We took out a few of the hay-filled killers. It seemed we'd make it out relatively unscathed, save for a forever fucked up psyche. However, we suddenly heard a shriek from the back of the line. We turned to see Terry being swarmed by 3 scarecrows. We rushed to help her, but it was too late. She was split near completely in half at the waist. John had to pull Becca and me away from our near-dead friend. Just as he turned to lead us away, he was attacked by a shovel-wielding straw man. Becca took it down with Larry's cane and beat it repeatedly. When she felt satisfied, she stood and stared at me with the most maniacal grin I'd ever seen. By the time we got our wits about us again and turned to help John, we realized he'd been dragged away by one of our attackers. We found him in the shed. The same tool that was once used to end the life of lonely farmer Larry now was being used to torture John. I took a weed whacker to the scarecrow and didn't stop until there was nothing but a pile of straw and torn clothes left. We locked the shed and barricaded the door. I went looking for any keys for any farm vehicle I could maybe find. Out of near 30 of those, we'd taken out maybe 10 to 12. So, we still had a hell of a fight ahead of us. Fortunately, they moved extremely slow and were easy to take out. Becca went to tend to John's wounds. It took what felt like hours to search through the mess in the shed that I imagined Larry made while struggling with his attackers earlier. Finally, I found a ring full of keys and went back to Becca and John. She gave me the bad news that he succumbed to his wounds. I showed her the keys and told her we needed to get out now. We loaded up, me with the weed whacker and Becca with the hedge trimmer, and prepared to give those bastards hell until we found a tractor and got out of this nightmare. We threw open the door and found ourselves staring down the last 20 or so straw men. As they began progressing toward us, we gave each other what we thought may be our final kiss and charged, taking down as many as we could. Eventually, we had enough of a path that we were able to bolt out and quickly locate a vehicle and rushed for it faster than I think I've ever ran. We hopped on, and after fumbling with the keyring for a moment, I found the right key and started it up. It came to life with a thunderous roar, and the lights lit up the now near pitch-black field. I turned the machine to face the last few nightmare creatures that were stumbling toward us. I floored the gas pedal, and as fast as the tractor could go, we marched toward our adversaries. Hearing the crunches under the tire was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in God knows how long. Once the machine had rolled over every last one of them, I turned toward the road and drove us to the nearest sign of civilization. We both were so fueled by adrenaline and fear that we hadn't realized how many wounds we'd suffered ourselves. We each had multiple slash marks and other bruises and bumps, but we were alive and spending a couple of nights in a hospital. While in that bed, Becca and I made one promise to each other. We were getting the hell out of Nebraska and as far away from those cornfields as we could, as soon as we could. And now we knew for sure we could face anything together. It was in that hospital she revealed to me that she had planned to propose at that Halloween party, and I ecstatically accepted when she asked officially. The cops found everything. They tried their best to find a reasonable explanation. The official story they settled on was that Larry went crazy and attacked us, killing our friends, but we were able to take him out and end his murder spree. And due to the traumatic nature of it, we were remembering the events differently. But what they couldn't explain was how a near 70-year-old man overpowered 2 football stars, but was taken down by Becca and me, who, while no slouches, were both relatively petite girls. Nor could they explain why all of the farmers' scarecrow posts were empty. My takeaway from this story? Note to self. Remember to make an ASMR video with the sound of straw and scarecrows being crunched underneath a moving tractor for about 3 hours. Until next time, remember, always keep a flamethrower at the ready while heading to your Halloween soirees.